Okay, people, let's get started. We've got a midterm next week, and a bunch of you have been emailing me about how to study for the midterm. And I've mentioned this a couple times in class before, but I'm going to mention it one more time. The thing to do for my parts of the course, for my lectures, is every one of them has a bunch of take-home points at the end. Go through those take-home points, be sure you understand them, be able to connect them to the displayed items in the lectures in your mind, and keep doing that until you can do them all, okay? And then a good strategy in general for a course like this that tends to try to be integrative is to try to think of one of those, take a look at one of those points, and try to connect it in your mind by some associational path to another one, okay? It can be almost anything at random. It can even be like a word association game with multiple neighbors. And that just helps establish connections in your mind. If there is a remark on one of the slides, like commit these numbers to memory, then you would be advised to commit them to memory, okay? If it doesn't say commit this number to memory, then I don't expect you to commit it to memory. People want to know how many mathematical formulae they're expected to know. And there are really only two I've stressed in any way. Ramsey's formula, you don't need to know how to derive it, but knowing what the terms are, given how much time I spent on it, all right? Which wasn't really my, right? But this is the way economists work, and I think it's worthwhile to figure it out, right? It's a good idea, given how much time we spent on that you know what those terms mean. The species-area relationship is the only other one that really we've used as a mathematical formula. And the species-area relationship is the primary way that biodiversity impacts of habitat loss are calculated, okay? Not a big deal, but it's one that's there. In my questions, which I've already made up, and the keys, there's some choice, right? You're not expected to answer every question. Every single question is somewhere between short and long answer, like a half-page answer, okay? That's it. There's a review session on Friday afternoon, and there's another one, I think it's Sunday night. That's right, Sunday night. I'll be there, and I'll answer your questions until the last of you crawls out, okay? All right? So that's it, all right? All right, let's talk about food. Feeding 9 to 10 billion people. The big problem with agriculture is that pasture land and cropland, although they only occupy 37% of the land surface, 6% is either urban or lakes, which kind of leaves it out of bounds. And 30% is just not arable at all. It's tundra, ice, desert, or just covered by rocks, all right? And that leaves one chunk, which is forests, that are left. Some of those forests are in the temperate and boreal. There's a bit of temperate forest which could be put back into cultivation in Eurasia and in the US, but that forest is important for the climate problem also, because it stores carbon. The other big chunk is in tropical rainforest, which is the largest repository of terrestrial biodiversity, and it's also important for the carbon cycle, as we'll see later in this lecture. And so expanding food production by expanding this number carries other nexus costs. So that's the point. This shows the number of millions of square kilometers, which is hundreds of millions of hectares, that are in cropland now, and the number from this slide is about 1,500. Some estimates are at about 1,600. This is maybe 1,550. These are cereals down here and other crops up here. And these are different categories of grazing land. And the important thing to note is that there's more grazing land than cropland, but a lot of it is these lighter colors here, which are arid. So even if we gave up those grazing lands, we couldn't turn them into cropland. But note that there is a great big slug. This is the wettest and most fertile grazing land, which is just sitting there, and which, if we actually shifted our diets as a species, would be available to turn into cropland or into something else. Now, shifting people's diets, as we'll see, is really hard, but it doesn't mean that it isn't there, all right? So there's that. These are where the agricultural lands are located. The amber color, sort of tan color, is pasture lands. There's a sort of color scale. And the green is croplands. And, you know, it's not too surprising. The grazing lands are in more arid places than the croplands everywhere. And you'll note that the big croplands are in areas outside of tropical forests still, all right? But that doesn't mean that you can't establish a cropland inside a tropical forest. A lot of pre-Columbian cultures, for instance, in Amazonia did precisely that. Now, it is true that they built artificial soils to do it, but we're pretty clever too. This is just a recap of something we've already looked at. Remember that 80% of threatened species are at risk because of habitat loss already, and 90% of these are due to agriculture. And so these changes have carried a considerable cost in terms of biodiversity, if in fact you care about biodiversity. And remember that if you take the species-area relationships and run them to equilibrium, they would be responsible for the loss of about 11% of the terrestrial species on the planet, which is not chicken fig. It's not a great extinction, but it's a lot of species, right? And this is the origin of new agricultural land over that 20-year period in the tropics. The dark green is tropical forest, and the light green is forest that was already whacked at least once by people. And you can see that essentially all of the new agricultural land at this point comes from tropical forest, and something like half of it comes from pristine tropical forest. And to be fair, these non-pristine forests, it's usually sort of a two-step process. You know, first you whack it for timber, and then you convert it to pasture land or something like that. And so even this lighter green, a lot of it would have been one stage before, would have been pristine forest. So that's pretty clear. Now here's the conundrum, all right? And the most important relationship in the lecture. It's the relationship between per capita GDP and per capita caloric demand. And these different colors represent different groupings of countries, all right? Where the G is the lowest income and the red is the highest income. And this is from the paper by Dave Tillman in 2011 in PNAS, but there are many, many, many analyses like these. You can go online and get FAO statistics. FAO is an organization, and download this data yourself and plot it. It's not hard to do. And what you see is that, and these are time series of these countries. So that's 1961 and that's 2003. And you can see how these individual groups of countries are developing. And they're developing along a common trajectory, what looks to be a common trajectory. And this is per capita GDP. That's 5,000 bucks, 10,000, 15. That's 25, so we're out here. And this is per capita caloric demand. And you can see that as people get wealthy, they consume more food in one way or another, all right? And a lot more. It's concave down, so it's decelerating, but still it's going up quickly. So it turns out that the primary driver of the increased food demand isn't more people, it's richer people, and this tight relationship between food demand and per capita GDP. If you look down at the lower graph here, this is per capita protein demand. And if you look at the numbers here, that's a tripling, whereas the per capita protein demand is going up by almost a factor of 7. And so what this shows is that as people get wealthy, they not only require more food, they specifically require they demand way more protein. And the vast majority of this protein is animal protein, all right? So those relationships appear to be kind of hardwired from this sort of thing. And there's an air of inevitability about it. But if you unpack these data, you'll discover that it's not quite right. Because different cultures have different relationships along this sort of general trend. They all have increasing demand and increased protein demands. But for instance, Indian subcontinent curve, the curve for the Indian subcontinent is much lower protein demanding because they're predominantly vegetarian than the rest of the world. And so it's not as though these traits aren't malleable, but they appear to be culturally enshrined. As soon as people start to become wealthy, they really want a lot of meat in their diet. This is why, for instance, the Chinese have a strategic national pork reserve. It's a big deal in China. So that if the pork supply ever starts to get low, the government releases a whole bunch of pork the way we in the US have a strategic oil reserve. Because it's a recipe for social unrest, given how important it is for the increasingly wealthy Chinese population to have the diet that they think goes along with their economic prospects. One other thing that's useful is to look at this scale, which a lot of you won't be able to read except on your computer screens, and you'll notice that that's 8,000 calories a day. So who here eats 8,000 calories a day? There you go. Good for you. All right, you must be an athlete. Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you're riding in the Tour de France or something like that, I think it's what, 6,000, right? Something like that. And so how do you get to 8,000 calories a day? And the answer is that you're not doing all the eating. This includes the amount that was eaten by the meat that you ate, okay? And so that's why the demands get so high. This is the primary calorie demand that's required of stuff the primary producers growing out of the ground, i.e. the plant matter. So feeding plants to animals is the way you get to 8,000, all right? You're probably all eating, except for the endurance athletes who are in season, are probably eating 2,000 to 3,000, something like that. All right, some of you less. Okay, so that's that. Now, the point of the story is that it's meat. And of course, the conversion of feed going in to live weight coming out in an animal, or feed going into edible food coming out of an animal, is really pretty shocking. Beef is 25 to 1. So it requires 25 times more feed fed to a cow to get the same mass of edible food out of that cow. All right? That 25 to 1 turns out to be the global average because, to a first approximation, cattle are king here. Pork is over twice as good, but it's at 9.4. Chicken is half pork at 4.5. Eggs are at 4.2. Carp, or other sort of pond-raised aquaculture fish, are at 2.3. And milk is 0.7. The point here that this is the relationship. Now, why is this such a big number? What's going on here? And the primary answer is that animals have to keep warm. So most of the energy that a cow eats simply goes into maintaining its high metabolic rate and elevated metabolism. That's it, right? And so it's burning most of the energy that it takes in up just to be a cow. And only a little bit of it goes into the mass of the cow, 10 to 1, and only a small fraction of the cow is edible. And that's because cows are big and they need like big structural bones to hold them up, all right? Whereas a chicken doesn't need as much. Now this is aside from any of the ethical considerations that are associated with eating meat. And we're going to talk about those later in the course. Right now, what we're doing is we're just doing calorie, and later we'll do greenhouse gas accounting of all of this. So the livestock production system is lucrative. It yields $1.4 trillion of revenue annually, globally, and employs 1.3 billion people. That's a big deal. 1.3 billion of our people are employed in raising livestock. It's a shocking number, really a big number. 70%, but only 17% of global calories and 33% of protein are coming from animals, which is also amazing if you look at the average Western diet. It means that a lot of diets are still relatively meat light. We now have 20 billion chickens in the world, 1.6 billion cattle, 1 billion pigs, 1 billion sheep, and 0.8 million. That's a tiny number of goats. 62% of crop production goes to humans, and 35% goes to animal feed before it gets to humans. So that still the majority of crop production is going into people and not into animals. 20% of cropland, though, grows animal feed. So that's productive cropland because 35% of total crop production goes to animal feed on 20% of the crop land. Livestock produce 40% of agricultural revenue, GDP. It's big business for people. So there's financially interested parties that are really tied up with this. And globally, 25 minutes of dry feed to 1 unit of dry edible meat, which was the cattle number. And that's the average for the globe. All right? You've seen this slide before, and this shows why it is that despite the fact that the diet becomes so protein rich, goes up 7-fold over the range of GDPs that were on one of the slides earlier, it's still the case that only 35% of crop production goes to animals, and 17% of global calories comes from animals. And that's because GDP per capita going up, and human food, it goes in, so the amount of the fraction of the diet that is produced by cropland in red versus animals in blue. So eating plant food in red versus eating animal food in blue. And you can see as people become wealthy, they disproportionately eat animals. All right, most of the cropland production for rich people is coming from animals and not from plants. And so the lower numbers on the previous slide are due to the disproportionately poor population we've got on the planet still. And of course, the planet is getting richer. Now, historically, the expansion of crop and animal production. Here's the production from 1960 to 2010. This is grains. These are cereals and root crops. And this is chickens, pigs, cattle and buffalo, sheep and goats. These are all increasing, all right? And this has historically been driven. This is a 50-year increase. Been driven by population growth and these diet shifts related to wealth, as they will be in the future. Now, in the past, most of the increased production, and this is good news, most of the increased production over the last 50 years has come from increasing yields, not expanded cropland. And so the question is, can we keep that rally going? Can we keep increasing agricultural yields on the same land rather than producing new land that we're already constrained, right? That is currently has some other purpose like preserving biodiversity and so on. And this is from crop breeding, fertilizer and pesticides use, and there are exceptions. So this is sub-Saharan Africa, where fertilizer application rates have remained low. We'll talk about that more later in the course. This is a complicated slide that looks at fertilizer application. And it increased 500% globally, 5x over a 20-year period from 1985 to 2005. That is unbelievable, all right? a 5x increase in global fertilizer application. Pesticide use also increased dramatically, and this shows where it happened, right? This is applied nitrogen on the landscape. You can see the northern Midwest is huge, northern Europe is huge, China is dark green there, and the Gangetic Plain, but all throughout the Indian subcontinent. Phosphorus, same thing with a bigger slug down here in South America. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the two most common plant-limiting nutrients. There are also trace nutrients that are important too, but these are the real big ones. Nitrogen, because plants need to make proteins, which have amino acids, which have nitrogen in them, right? So your primary nitrogen in your body is in all your proteins and enzymes. Phosphorus, because DNA and RNA requires phosphorus, right? So this is applied nitrogen per ton of yield. Big numbers means that you put a lot of nitrogen on per unit of yield that you get out. You can see that dark places here are China and India, where they put more nitrogen on per ton of yield than, for instance, we do in the United States or that they do in Europe. Same story with phosphorus. So in these countries, the Indian subcontinent and in China, they really pack on the fertilizer, and they pack on the fertilizer per unit yield they get much more than we do. And so this is a measure of excess nitrogen and phosphorus on the landscape, and it's darkest green in those places because they're putting on a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus per unit yield. And one of the consequences has been the growth in dead zones in the ocean. This is the bottom of the Mississippi River, that's Louisiana, and these colors indicate a loss of oxygen. And how does that work? When you've got a bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus and it runs out of farm fields and down some river and gets dumped in the ocean, the organisms, the phytoplankton, the microscopic plants of the ocean are typically nitrogen and phosphorus limited. So they explode in their production as they feed on these formerly limiting nutrients. As they do so, they consume oxygen in the water. There's so many of them. And eventually they make that water anoxic. And they limit themselves, all right? And so this water then becomes toxic to oxygen-requiring life. And we've got increasingly these dead zones all over the world. And it's not to be surprised, right? Because if we've increased fertilizer use over 20 years by 5-fold, this shouldn't really surprise us. And so these things now are showing up literally all over the world. All right, and it's a concern. We really don't know how much to be worried about this. It sucks to be a fish swimming into one of those areas, but we don't really know what the global consequences are yet. Okay, so this simply shows that agricultural land did expand, but these increases were much smaller than the productivity increases over the same period. There's a map down here you can study at your leisure with blue for decreases in cropland, like down here in the US where cropland is still going back to forest in the southeast, and red is increases in cropland. These numbers are small numbers though, you can't really read it, but they're less than 1% per year of the land. Little numbers. There is an exception, not necessarily in developing nations, so that in Africa, 45 million hectares have gone into African cropland that used to be in non-cropland, 21 million in Latin America, and 15 million in Southeast Asia. And if you total those numbers up, that's like 75, but it's like 80 million hectares, which is roughly, think of it as sort of a half to a third of US cropland that has been added over a 20-year period, all right, globally. Now that's not a giant number, but it is a number, all right? That's a significant piece of real estate. So when you drive around in one of these countries, you'll see all kinds of what looks like relatively new cropland. But also be advised that cropland is concentrated along the road you're driving along. If you sort of head off into the bush, it's a different story. This is a problem, but still, the vast majority of our increased production, even in the tropics, has been because of increases in yield, not increases in land area. This figure I like. because there's a lot of information in it. And it's worth studying. I'm not going to test you on anything in this figure, but it's in here because this is the sort of figure a smart person wants to look at for a while if you think about the food system. What we've got in this axis is harvested area ratio. So as you go out this axis, it means that the 2 out here means that the cropland area devoted to a crop has increased by a factor of 2. So a doubling of cropland devoted to that crop. As you go up in this axis and you reach 2, which it would be up here somewhere, that's 1.8, that means the yield per unit area has doubled over the period of this, the 20-year period from 1985 to 2005. So this shows which crops have had increased total global yields because they've increased yield per hectare. That is better fertilizers, better varieties and that sort of thing, more efficient practices, versus those that have increased in production because we've actually increased farmland. And you notice that a lot of the big ones out here, size indicates how much is produced. That's wheat, that's corn, and that's rice. Most of them are increased production because they've got increased yields. They're up high on this axis, not increased production. Some crops like barley and oats are actually decreasing, all right, in area produced. The one real exception to this rule is soybeans, okay? You see soybeans out here. And soybeans, as you may or may not know, are expanded, right? So when you talk about deforestation in Brazil and you ask what happens to that land, if it's not pasture land, it's in soybeans, okay? So soybeans have both increased yields per hectare and a big increase in the amount that's grown. Sunflower seeds down here are an example of a crop that has only increased in production because it's increased in area. More people, farmers plant soybeans than they used to, but sunflowers, I don't know what I just said, sunflowers. I want to say sunflowers. If I said something else, erase it. These are sunflowers, these are those giant things with a big yellow flower. Sunflowers are sunflowers like they used to be, and we haven't increased the yield of them at all, which is not too surprising given how extreme a sunflower is, right? Like twice as tall as you are, has a flower this big, and so on, right? Okay, so food demand doubles by mid-century. What are we going to do about it? And there are two extreme choices: increase the amount of cropland or increase the yield per hectare. And as we'll see, there are a couple of other choices too. Most important, we could change, if we wanted to, fractionally, how much of our diet was animal, and we could also change how much food we waste, right? Those two things. So to figure out a projection, to actually say something like, demand is going to double by mid-century, how do you do it? Well, you combine three things. There is a projection for the population growth of the world over this period, topping out at some number in the vicinity of 10 billion people. This one comes from the UN, and there are many of these, and they all roughly agree, plus or minus a billion or so. But there will be an increase from now until 2050. And if these relationships hold, each of those people will become wealthier. This is the projected GDP per capita in one global sort of projection, and there are tons of these. And it shows what the GDP is going to be per capita in 2050. In the United States, it's going to be $85,000 US, pretty good, per capita. So a family of four will be about 300K. So if the US continues to grow as it has historically, that's a pretty good number. Bangladesh will be up to $7,000, which is roughly the GDP per capita of Mexico today, right? That'd be the poorest country on this list. So you have a population growth, you have a GDP per person in each country, and you have a curve for the amount of caloric demand per unit GDP per capita, and you can multiply those together, and sum it all up for all the countries and get a global caloric demand. And that's what's done. All right, so you see how you could use those three data sets. This one, driving this one, to give you a total demand. This just shows from this Tillman paper that we were looking at before with the colored diet demand of calories and protein per unit GDP per capita. What were in his paper. This is per capita GDP. These are these same countries from the poor ones to the wealthy ones. And this is the growth expected from 2005 to 2050. You'll notice that in developed countries, the GDP per capita doesn't go up that much. But in developing countries, in particular these countries in the middle, like the BRIC countries, like India and China, it goes up a lot, right? 300% here. Doesn't go up very much in the poorest countries. Per capita caloric demand then goes up mostly in the middle countries as well, and per capita protein demand goes up mostly in those countries that are in that boost phase where their economic growth rate is going up quickly. This is just one more look at the same thing. Developing countries, if you look at the increase in the demand for meat, we've got a 3x roughly change there, but in developed countries, it's going from 73 to 94, which is a small number. So this is mostly a developing world phenomenon as the developing world climbs up that income curve and gets on the flatter part of the calories per unit GDP per capita. Okay, so 2050 food demand, according to Tillman, population grows from 7 to 9 to 10 billion. GDP per capita globally triples, meat demand quadruples, and food demand doubles. That's the way that's working, okay? So food demand is primarily doubling because meat demand is quadrupling, right? And that's all happening more because GDP per capita is tripling than because of this relatively small change in global population size. Got it? Okay. So that's good. Now, if yield improvements track regional business as usual from 1965 to 2005, okay? So in other words, if we only have historical yield improvements with that increase in wealth, and we don't do anything else, right? We don't do anything else about shifting diet or changing waste or anything like that, then we're going to need approximately another 1 billion hectares of cropland. And as we've seen before, this is going to be in less developed nations, and the only land really left is forested land, tropical forest land. And so that has other nexus consequences. So this food problem is a significant driver of what's going on, and it is the largest source of interaction among the nexus problems. So 1 billion hectares, a loss of 1 billion hectares, if we don't do anything else but sort of run the clock as we've run it over the last, over the 20 years from, or 40 years from 1965 to 2005, that would cause a mass extinction. Remember, we've already got this loss of forested area, and you can actually do the math, and you end up with a very substantial loss in species. You could use, in fact, that species area relationship to figure out how much, but it's tens of percent, right? It's a significant biodiversity hit. It's not like reducing, like getting rid of the entire Amazon, or getting rid of all the tropical rainforests, which would leave you with 60% reduction in the global terrestrial biodiversity, but it's a significant hit. 1 billion hectares is like a half to a third of the remaining tropical rainforest. So this has very, very significant biodiversity impact. But as serious as that is, and remember that it would take a long time for most of those impacts to be realized, right? Because extinctions take a long time because they lag behind. And there's always the possibility that as you get rich, you reforest some. As big as those are, there are there we go. There are bigger implications for climate change. And this is why. This is a little cartoon of how much carbon is stored in a hectare that is 100 by 100 meters, or about a little over 2 acres of habitat. And this is a primary forest. This is a tropical rainforest. And these are tons of carbon in the biomass stored in the place. Okay, tons of carbon. And remember, to get to CO2, you would multiply those numbers by 44/12, right? That's one of the things you're supposed to, that's one of the things where I said, commit this number to memory. So the important thing is that primary forest has about 200 tons of carbon stored in each hectare of primary forest in living trees, and 100 tons of carbon stored in the soil. Grasslands only have 5 tons in the living vegetation because the grasses don't have wood, right? But they have more, actually, 150 stored in the soil. Pastures have 9 tons of carbon above ground, and that's because they are encroached by woody plants that the cattle don't like to eat, and that's why you keep having to clear a pasture all the time if it's in a place that can grow bushes. And less below ground because the cattle are consuming and taking stuff away. Cropland is the smallest, 2 tons of carbon per hectare and 75 tons of carbon underneath, and that's because we keep plowing up the soil, bringing it to the surface, and the carbon hits the atmosphere, oxygen gets into it, and it decomposes more rapidly. So it loses some carbon that it would otherwise have had. And the upshot is that when you convert primary forest to cropland, you lose 25 plus 198, or like 225 tons of carbon per hectare. And that's a big number. It's a couple, like 3 loaded tractor-trailer semis of carbon, and almost 4 times that in CO2. So it's like 10 or 11 or 12 semis worth of CO2 going up into the atmosphere for each hectare that you do. And so that billion tons, that billion hectares of tropical forest that we would have to convert would cause a CO2 emission of more than 800 billion tons, okay? Or about 800 billion tons. And that would increase the atmospheric CO2 by about 50 parts per million. And if you remember back to what the budget is, we're at about 410 now, and 2 degrees requires that we top out under 450. You can see that this alone puts us over the goals of Paris, just this one action. And so just if we were just trying to manage the carbon problem, let alone the biodiversity problem, if we were gonna plan on doing this to keep our food demand met, then we blow by Paris just in this one action, not burning any fossil fuel at all. And so this is where the primary interaction is then between the food and the greenhouse problem. And there's a secondary interaction too. There are lots and lots of claims that our food system is responsible for some giant fraction of our total greenhouse emissions. A lot of these are built by advocates. It depends on what global warming potentials are, which one you use. You remember, you can choose your own time frame. So methane, which is produced in rice paddies and from enteric fermentation by cattle and sheep and goats. If you use the 20-year global warming potential, then that's times 86. And if you use the 100 years, times 33. So you can, double or triple your number just by choosing a different convention. I've used 100-year global warming potentials here. And here, what you see is that agriculture is responsible for 14%, which is about 1/7 of the total emissions by that measure. That's not chicken feed. 1/7 is 1/7, and it's pretty big. And if you look at that, where that 1/7 comes from, it comes almost equally from N2O, which is a greenhouse gas, long-lived in the atmosphere like CO2, and it's from the oxidation of nitrogen fertilizers, okay? And the second one is methane, CH4, and that's coming primarily from rice paddies and enteric fermentation and rice. And there's a little bit from CO2, and that's from churning up the soil and releasing CO2 still from the conversion of recently converted land. And it's also from like burning fossil fuel to drive tractors around and that sort of thing, all right? So this story is primarily a story about the non-CO2 gases right now, the impact that we're currently having on the greenhouse gas budget, which is kind of interesting. Whereas the story that I was just showing you before, that story is a CO2 story, all right? So that's like on top of current agriculture, just from land clearing, because the only land we've got left to do this would be tropical rainforest. All right, just a couple of other slides showing this. These are CO2 from fossil fuels and cement and some other things, right? These are percent of total emissions and that sort of thing that are coming from agriculture and different sources. The big one down here is non-agricultural, that's fossil fuels and cement. The lighter green is from forestry and other land use, and then there's N2O from agriculture and CH4 from agriculture and other sources. And you can see that both the N2O and the methane from those sources are increasing just the way that CO2 is. In ice cores, this is 1750 to 2010 roughly. And so the point is that all of those other gases are increasing. Yes? So it turns out it depends on the rice. And this is one of the nice stories is that, we'll discuss this later, but it's possible to manage rice so that it doesn't do it. What happens is that when you flood a rice paddy, so here, back up a bit. So when you digest something, if you're a microbe especially, or if you're a human, what you're doing is you're oxidizing. You're slow burning the fuel. And so that works in the presence of oxygen, and that's why we exhale CO2. We're eating carbon fuels, and we burn them slowly and turn them into CO2. We burn them catalytically, we oxidize them catalytically. Now, if there's no oxygen around, it turns out that the best way to make energy is to convert those fuels into methane, CH4, because there's no oxygen to combine to the carbons. So if there's no oxygen around in your habitat, methanogens that are anoxic actually outcompete the oxidizers that can't feed as effectively, right? And so that releases methane. So when you flood a rice paddy and the organisms in the soil try to use up and decompose the organic matter that's in the soil, the oxygen levels are used up by those oxygen producers. And if it's kind of stagnant water that isn't stirred up very much, all the oxygen gets used up. And so it switches over to these methane emitters. And so by simply managing the way you flood rice paddies differently, you can eliminate this source mostly. Okay? This is the money slide. I like this slide a lot. It's got a giant amount in it. But this just shows you the greenhouse gas implications of what you eat. So, what this shows is the kilograms of CO2 equivalent, right? So that's converting methane into CO2 using 100-year global warming potential, or N2O into CO2 using 100-year global warming potential. So the kilograms of CO2 you emit per kilograms of food that you eat for different food categories, all right? This is how much you emit per unit, equivalent unit of mass. Think of it as a global warming potential for food. And I think I've got some other things. Yeah, so first of all, beef is 26, okay? So that means for each kilogram of beef you eat, you actually cause the emission of 26 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That's a big number. So the same CO2 as burning 3.2 gallons of gasoline. Eating a half-pound steak is like driving 22 miles at 30 miles per gallon, right, roughly. All right? And that's just because of what we've been talking about. And remember that increased temperatures will decrease yields for most crops. So you get decreasing yields as a result of the increasing temperature change. So this is all tied together. Global warming is tied up with dietary demand because of land conversion and because of all these other things that we've been talking about, in particular methane and N2O. there's a big implication of your diet for emissions. I want to talk just a little bit about water use because I'm running out of time. This shows irrigated area in 2005 and 2007 versus projected in 2050. And you'll see that water use, in fact, for agriculture, which is irrigated water use, 75% of the water we use goes to irrigation. And that's only going to increase a little bit. You see that? Well, the darker blue is how much it's going to increase. Those are small increases, despite this big increase in demand. Why is that? It's because we've already irrigated just about every place we can irrigate. All right, we're already using all of that water. All right, this isn't that we wouldn't want to do more. It's that we ran out, and so our only option really is to use water more efficiently if you want to increase the amount of water that goes into food. All right. So, but the point is that with 75% of water that we use as a species going into irrigation, there's a big connection between the water and food problem, independent of the connection from food to climate change to rainfall, right? These things are all tied together, which is why this is a course. So get out your clickers, and we'll finish with a couple of little quizzes. All right? So the first one is consider your personal CO2 emissions caused by eating 50 pounds of beef. Now that's obviously not at once. At least, the guy eats 11,000 calories, maybe. But 50 pounds of beef, joyriding 100 miles at 15 miles per gallon in a gas guzzler. So, a 1972 Plymouth Barracuda and, top down and blasting. Or flying to EEB semester in Panama and back. All right, so which of these is the largest? All right, finish up now. And the answer is flying to EEB semester in Panama and back. So, physician, heal thyself. I mean, the point is that we're not going to solve this problem just by being virtuous, I'm afraid, right? Okay, I think I have one more here. Let's see. Yeah, see, 818 kilograms for Panama. And so it's close. This is actually close. 50 pounds of beef is second. Gas guzzler's best. Panama's the worst. Okay, that's it. Teaching goals. I'll see you guys probably next. I'll be at lecture, but I'll see you at the review if you come.